If you turn to 2 Kings, continue the story from last Sunday night on this situation between Hezekiah and Sennacherib. And in chapter 19, we had actually chapter 18 last week. We had seen that Hezekiah had sent Rabshakeh to speak to Hezekiah, and in verse 19, he challenged him in a lot of ways. I want to go over those ways real quick, and then we can get into the response of Hezekiah, because it's a godly response, and it's something in your warfare you should recognize it. It may help you in the battles that you have. But I want to quickly go over what, because I was rethinking and meditating on this. In verse 19, thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, what confidence is this wherein you trust? He's challenging the Jews on the wall, and he says, you say, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom dost thou trust that thou rebellest against me? Now behold, you trust upon the staff of this bruised reed, even upon Egypt, on which if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, unto all that trust on him. As I read the rest of this, I want you to think what he's trying to say here. And he's trying to say to them, you're alone, you're small, you're wrong, give in. It's the attack the world is going to. I've just been musing on how the wiles of the devil and attacking. He's basically saying your confidence is in nothing. You have no friends. You have no strength. You should simply give in to what the world has to offer you and the way of the world. So if you follow along a little farther, then he says, verse 22, but if you say unto me, we trust in the Lord our God, is not that he whose high place and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and said to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem. So he's also attacking the doctrine, the gospel doctrines, and trying to exploit divisions in the church. Now, therefore, I pray thee, give pledges, give pledges to my lord, the king of Assyria, and I will deliver thee 2,000 horses, if thou be able on thy part to set riders upon them. So it's give in, go my way. You're weak. You're weak. You can't resist what I'm offering. And then he goes, how then will you turn away the face of one captain of the least of my master's servants, and put thy trust on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Am I now come up without the Lord against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. He's mocking. He's mocking the fact that the Lord is sovereign. He's saying, well, I wouldn't be here. You hold to these doctrines, and then the Lord must have me here to destroy you. So he's mocking their doctrine. He's mocking their trust and hope in the gospel preached and in the Christ crucified. And he's applying every kind of pressure to get them to go along and to give in. So the men of Hezekiah say, don't talk in the Jews' language, just talk to us in Syrian, and he doesn't want to do that. He wants to bring everybody in on this and do more and more damage, as much damage as he can. Tells them in verse 29 that Hezekiah is deceiving them. There won't be any deliverance. Tells them in verse 30, don't let him convince you to trust in the Lord, because the Lord there's no deliverance there. There is no deliverance. Again, just a direct attack on the gospel. And verse 31, don't hearken to Hezekiah, but rather give in. Make a present, come out, and it'll all be well. Everything will be well if you just go the way of the world. If you go the way of the world, all your problems will be solved. No more problems. You'll be welcomed into the family. You'll be like everybody else, enjoying all the privileges and benefits of the friendship of the world. And there isn't going to be any other deliverance, so don't wait on it. He says, others have succumbed. Why won't you? So that's his message. And let's now start into Hezekiah's response. I read some of it last week, but I wanted to go the full distance here in chapter 19. It came to pass when King Hezekiah heard it that he rent his clothes, he covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. That's step number 1. And he sent Eliakim, which was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and the elders of the priests covered with sackcloth to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. You might notice there, the 2 men that had heard the words directly from Rabshakeh, he's sending to Isaiah, plus a couple of others, the elders. And when they had said unto him, thus saith Hezekiah. This is it. So now Hezekiah is speaking to Isaiah to pass along the information. Thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of trouble and of rebuke and of blasphemy, for the children are come to birth, and there is not strength to bring forth. It may be the Lord thy God will hear all the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria his master has sent to reproach the living God, and will reprove the words which the Lord thy God hath heard. Wherefore lift up thy prayer for the remnant that are left. So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall you say to your master, Thus saith the Lord, Be not afraid of the words which thou hast heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor, and he shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. So Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah, for he had heard that he was departed from Lachish. And when he had heard say of Tirhakah, king of Ethiopia, Behold, he's come out to fight against thee, he sent messengers again unto Hezekiah, saying, okay, so let me just stop for a second. What's happening here is Rabshakeh, they've got them encircled, and they're sort of waiting them out. And Rabshakeh, in the meantime, goes back to Sennacherib, but Sennacherib has heard a rumor, and he's heading off to a battle with the king of Ethiopia, which is a guy named Tirhakah. So in verse 10, it says, Thus shall you, but he's going to send another message back to Hezekiah. He said, Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, Let not thy God, in whom thou trust, deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be delivered into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, thou hast heard what the king of Assyria have done to all lands by destroying them utterly. And shalt thou be delivered? Have the gods of the nation delivered them which my fathers have destroyed, as Gozan and Haran and Rezeph, and the children of Eden which were in Thelasar? Where is the king of Hamath and Arpad and Sepharvaim and Hena and Iva? So here comes another message. Okay. And same message as Rabshakeh had said. He just adds on a couple of other cities that he's put under his thumb. And Hezekiah received the letter of the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord God of Israel, which dwell between the cherubim, thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. Lord, bow down thine ear and hear. Open, Lord, thine eyes and see, and hear the words of Sennacherib, which hath sent him to reproach the living God. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have destroyed the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, and the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they have destroyed them. Now therefore, O Lord our God, I beseech thee, save thou us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord God, even thou only. Then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, That which thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria, I have heard. This is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. The virgin, the daughter of Zion, has despised thee and laughed thee to scorn, and the daughter of Jerusalem has shaken her head at thee. Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed? And against whom hast thou exalted thy voice, and lifted up thine eyes on high, even against the Holy One of Israel? By thy messengers thou hast reproached the Lord, and hast said, with the multitude of my chariots I am come up to the heights of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon, and will cut down the tall cedar trees thereof, and the choice fir trees thereof. And I will enter into the lodgings of his borders, and into the forest of his Carmel. I have digged and drunk strange waters, and with the sole of my feet have I dried up all the rivers of besieged places. Hast thou not heard long ago how I have done it, and of ancient times that I have formed it? Now have I brought it to pass that thou shouldest be to lay waste fenced cities into ruinous heaps. Therefore their inhabitants were of small power; they were dismayed and confounded. They were as the grass of the field, and as the green herbs, and as the grass on the housetops, and as corn blasted before it be grown up. But I know thy abode, and thy going out, and thy coming in, and thy rage against me. Because thy rage against me and thy tumult is come up into my ears, therefore will I put my hook into thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back by the way by which thou camest. And this shall be a sign unto thee. Now he's speaking to Hezekiah. This shall be a sign to thee, Hezekiah. He just pronounced on Sennacherib what's going to happen to him. Now he's going to talk to Hezekiah. You shall eat this year such things as grow of themselves, and in the second year that which springs of the same, and in the third year sow ye, and reap, and plant vineyards, and eat the fruits thereof. And the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall yet again take root downward, and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go forth a remnant, and they that escape out of Mount Zion, and the zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this. Therefore thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with a shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend this city, to save it for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake. And it came to pass that night, that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. That's 185,000. That's the size of the entire army of Germany, just to give you a sense of the scope of the death that God brought to bear on them. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sherazar his son smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Armenia, and Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. A lot here to digest, but we see, in going up to the first verses, we see that Hezekiah, responding to Rabshakeh, goes into the house of the Lord, and he sends his two men and the elders to Isaiah, and saying it's a day of trouble. It's a it may be. You can see that it's a day of rebuke. It's a day of blasphemy. Here we are, these lost haters of the world coming against us, and we don't have strength to fight these guys. We can't. What are we to do? He says, the children are come to birth. There's no strength to bring forth. We have no ability to fight this, and it's deadly destruction right at our doorstep, And he calls upon Isaiah, and in a sense, almost like a self-deprecating way, or some sense of the sin of his own nation. He calls upon Isaiah, call upon the Lord thy God. He doesn't even call him their God anymore. He's so embarrassed and ashamed about how God has humiliated him in this. And he says, it may be the Lord thy God, Isaiah, will hear the words of Rabshakeh. And who is he reproaching? He's reproaching the living God. The offense here from Hezekiah is, God, he is reproaching you. And he calls upon Isaiah to lift up prayer for the remnant that are left, this small group. So, point number one, he calls for Hezekiah responds by, where's the support of the ministry? So he is faced with a difficult situation, extremely difficult situation. And the first thing he does is, I want to inform my pastor, if you will. I want to talk to those who bring the gospel into my world. And he doesn't jump to answer Rabshakeh. He's not quickly coming up with an answer to say something to Rabshakeh. He addresses first things first. What saith the Lord in these matters? So Hezekiah also doesn't take the assault personally. He says that this is a reproach against the living God. And I think in your own life, when things are coming your direction, you can look at these things. If you can look at these things more broadly and say, what has the Lord brought your way? And when persecution and affliction and hatred come your direction, who are they hating? Who are they really trying to afflict, and who are they trying to assault? You might say, well, some people who assault you know some things, and some don't know others. But from your perspective, this is who is motivating them to do what they're doing, and where is the attack really coming from? So Hezekiah knows he doesn't take the assault personally. He says, "This Lord, that he's here to, as he said, he sent his messengers to reproach the living God." Hezekiah knows the battle is beyond his strength, as I mentioned before, and prays that God would hear and God would respond. So the takeaways here are: when the battle turns against you, when the battle turns against me, what should we do? A, seek the support of the ministry. B, understand and pray that God would defend his ministry and defend you as underneath that ministry, because the assault is against him. And number 3, bow to and call upon God in your time of need. Going down to verse 5, we see that Isaiah has a response for them. And he says, don't be afraid. Can't you hear the words of Christ in that response? Because so many times with the apostles, he'd say, fear not, fear not, fear not. They're out on the boat, winds and the waves crashing. The boat's almost halfway underwater. And he comes up from the hold and says, fear not, fear not. And speaks to the winds and the sky and causes the sea to calm and the winds to stop. And it's just, I like the way the apostles, respond to that. They say, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the waves obey him? And so here we see this word of comfort from Isaiah, fear not. And be not afraid of the words which you've heard. He's blaspheming me. God says he's blaspheming me. You're exactly right in your prayer. That he's not after you, he's after me. You can hear when Paul, when he was on the road to Emmaus, and going to chase down Christians and murder or have them thrown in jail or whatever he could do to them. Knocked off of his horse, lightning bolt. Says, Lord, who art you? And Saul says, Lord, who art thou? He says, I'm Jesus whom you persecute. I thought he was going to persecute Christians. No, he's persecuting Christ. Christ takes persecution against you as a believer, the same as persecution against himself. We see it here. We see it with Saul. We see it everywhere in the scripture. Then he says, behold, I'll send a blast upon him. That word blast there in the Greek is the same word as a spirit or a wind or an uncontrollable impulse. He says, I'm going to give Sennacherib an uncontrollable impulse. He's going to do something he doesn't even want to do. He thinks he's in control, but he's not. I'm going to send a blast upon him, an impulse he cannot resist. He'll hear a rumor, and he's going to have to respond to that rumor. And when he responds to that rumor, it'll be his undoing. And so we'll get to that rumor in just a minute. But turn to Proverbs 21:1, and you'll see the basic outlines of Hezekiah as an enemy, Sennacherib as an enemy of the gospel, or any enemy of the gospel. And Proverbs 21 and verse 1 says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turns it whithersoever he will. So Sennacherib thinks he is a master of his destiny, brags as being a master of his destiny. Who can resist what my fathers and me? And it turns out, as it turns out, he can't resist the unresistible, the uncontrollable impulse, the wind that blows across him. It says, you better go fight the king of Ethiopia, and you better be distracted, and he will be. So in verse 9, picking up from 9 to 13, there's the Tirhakah. It's also another famous king. I mentioned last Sunday night, that most of this is historical record, and you can find pictures sitting in the British Museum of these various battles. Tirhakah was also a very famous king at that time. Actually ruled not just Ethiopia, but all the way across to Egypt. It says he's come out. He hears this thing in verse 9. He heard say, Tirhakah has come out to fight against you. But he's not to be deceived, and this is the tenacity of those who hate God and those who hate the preaching of the gospel. The tenacity is such that he can't just go fight Tirhakah and just let it be. He has to make sure he sends another message to Hezekiah to say, "I'm coming to get you. I'm coming to get you." So don't trust in Hezekiah. Let not thy God in whom you trust deceive thee. I have destroyed all these lands. Says the same thing he said before, but he makes a point to say it again, and also saying I've destroyed other lands as well. So the point here is that assaults against your faith may come in waves. It's not just going to be one; it's going to be 2 and 3 and 4, and this is an ongoing battle. And he's in many ways he's like Pilate. When Pilate says to Jesus, "Don't you understand? I can do this and I can do that." Jesus says, "You have no power at all against me except you were given above." Sennacherib is living a life of an illusion. He's living in an illusion that he's in control of the situation, and God's going to bring that message to him here in just a little bit. So Hezekiah gets this second letter. They already heard it from Rabshakeh. Now he gets the letter. And he takes that letter into the house of the Lord and spreads it before God. I can't think of anything better for us to do in our time of trouble than to take our issues and lay them out before God with our face down on the ground and say, "Look at the way it is, Lord. See how they are assaulting you." And he says, "Bow down your ear, open your eyes, hear the words which he sent to reproach the living God." And it's a cry out that, and Moses would say the same thing. Even when they were going to, when the Jews were going to be destroyed, Moses would say, "If they destroy us, what's going to become of your great name?" The concern of the believer is always the glory of Christ. It's the glory of Christ. Me dying, that's not a big deal, but what's going to happen to your name? That's the big deal. And we see the same attitude in Hezekiah, and open your eyes, Lord. He's mocking you. He's assaulting you. He's rampaging and raging against you. It doesn't matter that he destroys us, but what will happen to your great name? And he, even in verse 17 says, he's right. He has destroyed all the land, the gods of the other nations. He's destroyed the nations, their lands. He threw their gods in the fire. Well, no big deal, because they weren't gods at all. It didn't matter. And on that, he's right. But he goes, "Now therefore, Lord, I beseech thee, save thou us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord God, even thou only." So save us, Lord, that your name would be magnified, that they'd know that you're the only God on earth, and thou only. That's a precious prayer. But he restates the core issue. This attack is on God. And you might notice that Hezekiah doesn't rest on the fact, I already told Isaiah this before. Goes back again. It's a continuing in prayer. Some people would say, "Well, I prayed about it one time." Well, go back, and his strategy. He returned to the Lord a second time on the second assault, calls upon God again, and called upon him under the assault of this second wave. And you might note just some other things on this, especially in terms of what Isaiah is going to say, that in bringing and in informing the pastors and the elders, and in some cases the whole church. It says the prayer of a righteous man availeth much. And so as those who lift up the issue in prayer, God hears. He's a very present help in the time of trouble. And so Hezekiah's request that God alone would be exalted in saving them. Save us out of his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art Lord, even thou only. And you might notice there that he's saying, not just one of many gods. He recognized the other gods had nothing, but thou and thou only. And then Isaiah responds from the word of the Lord to him, and has a word of comfort from God that is revealed to him in verse 20. And he says, I've heard the prayer you've prayed against Sennacherib. And then he has two messages. He has a message for Sennacherib, and he has a message for Hezekiah. And the message for Sennacherib is really, really interesting. He starts talking about, the virgin daughter has despised thee, and et cetera, et cetera. But in verse 23, by thy messengers you've reproached the Lord, and you've said, with the multitude of my chariots I've come up to the height of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon, and will cut down the tall cedars, the firs. I'll enter them into the lodgings. I've digged and drunk strange waters. And he's basically talking, he's repeating to Sennacherib, this is what you've been saying. You've been saying that you are able to destroy whatever you wish to destroy. As far as a battle plan, he's digged and drunk strange waters. When you're in battle, you have to, they say an army travels on its stomach. So he has perfected the art of war. And part of that art of war is being able to get water to sustain yourself as you're attacking others, to have the water and the food that you need. He says, I've digged and drunk strange waters. I've been able to get water to sustain my attacks. In the meantime, with the sole of my feet, I've dried up the rivers of besieged places. I've cut off the water to them, but made sure I've got the water. He goes, and here's where he says this. This is where he instructs him in verse 25. Have you not heard long ago how I have done it, and of ancient times that I have formed it? Now I have brought it to pass that you should be to lay waste fenced cities into ruinous heaps. He's saying to Sennacherib, you're nothing more than my tool to do exactly what I wanted you to do. Turn to Isaiah chapter 10. It's a perfect description of what's going on here. So God is going to instruct Sennacherib in his sovereignty and omnipotence, and how Sennacherib is boasting is completely out of line with reality. In Isaiah 10, in verse 15, it says, shall the axe boast itself against him that heweth therewith? Or shall the saw magnify itself against him that shaketh it? As if the rod should shake itself against them that lift it up, or as if the staff should lift itself up, as if it were no wood. So he's basically saying, you're an axe. You're an axe that I've been using to do these things. Going back to the verse, he says, I brought it to pass that you would do this, in verse 25. Therefore, the inhabitants were of small power. In fact, I even made the inhabitants of small power so you could accomplish it. All of these things have been in my hand. They were dismayed and confounded. Why? Because I deemed it to be so, saith the Lord. They were as the grass of the field. I deemed it to be so. And so your victories are hollow. Your victories are what I intended to occur, not your great wisdom and cunning and skill at all. It's got nothing to do with it. Therefore, in verse 27, but I know thy abode, that going out, that coming in, and thy rage against me. So, I've got you encircled. I know exactly what you're doing, and I'm utterly in control. Because thy rage against me and thy tumult is coming up into my ears, I'm going to put a hook. I'm going to show you. I'm going to drag you away the same way that you came. And you might notice that hook in the nose, the bridle, and the lips. That's the way that the Assyrians would do to the kings that they took over. They would put certain things in their nose and hooks, and they would humiliate them in different ways. God's going to humiliate him the same way he humiliated his enemies. And then he said, so It's just, to me, it's instructive. He says, he knocks all that he is proud about out from underneath him. All that Sennacherib is proud about, all of his great victories, he knocks out from underneath him and says that they're not victories at all. They're not victories at all, but what I intended to have done. And then in verse 29, he comforts Hezekiah. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But the message to Sennacherib is that God has enabled him to accomplish what he intended. He brought it to pass. His boasting is foolishness. And by the way, his enemies were of little power. Why? Because that was, again, of the hand of God. All his motions were under divine cognizance, if you will. He understood and directed all of his motions and movements. He knew his going in, his coming out, his rage. He knows it all. His rage is against, he also knows that his rage and his pride is against him. He's going to turn him around in an unpleasant fashion, the way he treated others, and send him back where he came. And here's oops, I lost my little verse there. In verse 32, this is exciting for believers. In 29, he comforts Hezekiah. God's going to bless and end this, and they're going to return to their life that they once knew, growing and planting vineyards and reaping harvests and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be a slow return to normality, but it's coming. But in verse 32, concerning Sennacherib again, he says, you're not going to come into the city. You're not going to shoot an arrow there. You're not going to have a shield there. You're not going to even cast up a bank against it. God is going to utterly defend his people. No attack on these people, on God's people, will stick. Turn to Isaiah 54. Those underneath the protection of Christ, nothing that Satan can bring your way, nothing that he can rail against you, no weapon of war that's formed against you will prosper. Thus saith the Lord. In Isaiah 54, in verse 17, it says, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. So God says to Sennacherib the exact same thing. You've got your weapons of war. You've got your this. You're going to attack the people. You're going to rage against them. You're going to demand their submission. It says nothing is going to succeed. God's going to defend his people, and they're not going to shoot an arrow. They're not going to bring a shit. Nothing. And which is to say, Satan's attacks, as many as he can bring your direction, with all his thousands of things to say against you, none of it sticks. For believers, the work of Christ was so adequate and so sufficient that when you're assaulted and Satan assaults you and brings hell to your doorstep, know this, that God is your defender. God is your defender. The work of Christ is complete and entire, and no weapon, no arrows shot against you, none of that is going to stick in the eyes of God. He will defend you to the uttermost. And to Hezekiah, it says, you're not only going to dwell in the land, you're going to be fed there. You're going to eat that which grows of itself in year 1, and then year 2, presumably, was a Sabbath year. There'll be plenty of volunteer plants, as they call it. You'll be able to eat. There'll still be enough. And in the 3rd year, it's back to business as usual. And so there's great comfort in that. Then in verse 35, I'd read this before, but the army is just sitting there. It doesn't say how it happens. It just says 185,000 people, dead corpses. I'm trying to imagine just the scenery of that. 185,000 dead bodies just laying out there. What happened? No one knows. It doesn't say, except this, that the Lord struck them down. Just struck them down. And Sennacherib, I guess, tail between his legs or a hook in his nose, certainly, dragged back to where he came from. And there, to as Isaiah said, to die by, he's going to die by the sword there, and he died by the sword of his own children. So in conclusion then, as far as messages on warfare, Sennacherib himself is like any man. He's confident that his success makes him worthy to whatever purpose he applies himself to. After all, he's gotten this far without God. Doesn't that prove that God is unnecessary? This is just the attitude of man. Sennacherib is just like anybody on the street. It's like any man born of Adam. He represents all that is embodied in the fall, a prideful rage against God. I'll have my own way of salvation, and I will fight and hate against anything that opposes my way of salvation, which is my own choice and my own destiny. His preference is for a land that's like unto the promised land, and that's what he prefers for you, is a near gospel, a somewhat gospel, a gospel of you're taking the chance and you're making a choice and you're doing this and you're doing that, whatever it happens to be. He's intent on destroying the gospel and dispatching all who hold it dear, just as Saul was. Just as Saul. Sennacherib is a picture of the natural man. He's not out of step with Saul or with anybody that hates the fact and has to be instructed as Sennacherib was. Sennacherib, it ain't the way it is. Your success is an illusion. There's a sad end to the man and his pride. First, God will instruct him of his power, and as he instructed Sennacherib. Second, he will die in his house of false worship, as Sennacherib did. For believers, there's a battle plan. Protection is under the gospel ministry. Alert the oversight of the church about the battle you're facing, that they may pray for you, as Isaiah prayed for Hezekiah, that you may you yourself bring and spread your issue out before God Himself, as will those in the church on your behalf as you fight your battles. Lay out the assault before God. Ask Him to open His eyes, open His ears, that He hears your problem. Understand that God has brought things your way, and that the attack that's occurring is upon God. It's upon His people, and if it's upon His people, it's upon Him. Turn to the last passage in 1 Peter. And I hope a verse of comfort for you. 1 Peter 5. Didn't we see Hezekiah do this in verse 6 and 7? Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. Cast all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. Isn't that what we just saw an example of? And Hezekiah is responding to this assault. So take comfort. No weapon that's formed against believers shall prosper. Every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment, He shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me. That's so exciting. It's the Christ's righteousness placed upon the believers, promised blessing, provision, protection. I'd also would add, don't be surprised when the battle comes your way. But take this as an example of a battle plan. What should I do? Where should I go? There's a place of refuge. It's in Christ Himself, and the protection He's afforded you in the church and in the gospel preaching. So hunker down under His wings, and that's where you'll find safety and comfort, no matter how withering the blast is against you, and it will be in your lifetime. Let your hope be in Christ and His work.